So as I mentioned, Colin invited me to participate in this very interesting and special issue, and at that point I was working on one of the things that has become sort of my central interest in the philosophy of neuroscience, which is how to get models in fMRI that are that are capable of parameterizing time, and I'm going to talk about that toward the end. But one of the things that I like about this paper is that it brings, I hope, brings attention to the fact that that we age and our brains change with aging. And in philosophy, it is very common to care about development, but people mostly care about the early stages of development, but they don't care a whole lot about the late stages of development. And I think that there is an important sort of interaction between the philosophy of neuroscience and research and aging. So hopefully, and then of course I have a very special place in my heart for aging. I was trained as a cognitive neuroscientist of memory and aging in a lab on memory and aging, and a lot of my work, experimental work, has been on memory and aging. So I was very happy to be able to bring these two things to bear. But so let's start. The main, I don't know what that means. Okay, so the main sort of point of departure is this notion of cognitive system. So the notion of cognitive system has been used pretty much since the 1950s or 60s, with various degrees of concreteness. But in any case, cognitive neuroscientists use the notion of cognitive system all the time. But it is kind of unclear, actually, what is meant by it. One way of thinking about it, which I call the traditional approach, is to define cognitive systems in terms of what I call an agent relative. So you could see this, for instance, in Jose Luis Bermudez's introduction to the philosophy of cognitive science. And the idea is just basically that you start off with the assumption that there is something like an agent, and then you sort of break down that agent into what philosophers sometimes call functional decomposition, and then you see this as early on as in Dennett as well as Bill Lacan. But cognitive scientists think something along those lines, that you have an agent and the agent is decomposable into functional units, and this in turn can be decomposable even more and more and more. You even have some philosophers like Cummins suggesting that the process of explaining cognitive faculties via breaking them down into component systems is actually the psychologist's the preeminent scientific goal. So the picture is something like this. You start with something like an agent, and then you identify within that agent a certain system, and you call that system N, and that system in turn is composed of some subsystems, and these subsystems in turn are composed of some subsystems until you end up with what Lacan calls homuncular functionalism. You end up at a very basic level in which there is simply no more decomposition possible. So that's way of thinking about cognitive system. The problem is that relatively recently, the extended cognition literature, like the advocates of the extended cognition, started to pose a challenge. And basically, the challenge was to just basically challenge the physical limits of a cognitive agent. And you all are very familiar with that literature. And the suggestion is that we really don't know to what are the boundaries of the agent. And if we don't know what are the boundaries of the agent, then we don't have a basic unit that can be easily decomposable. So instead of that, to sort of answer this challenge, many philosophers try kind of like a different tack, what I would call the bottom-up approach, which is to try to find necessary and sufficient conditions for a certain component to be a constitutive member of a cognitive system and or a set of components to constitute a cognitive system, as opposed to either a non-cognitive system or a non-system. This challenge, the try to find these necessary and sufficient conditions, is often known as the demarcation challenge, which, as I put in the paper, is the problem of identifying a reliable way to determine which of the mechanisms causally responsible for the production of certain cognitive processes do constitute the cognitive system which is responsible for such a process, and which mechanisms are not. This is the way in which Adams and Aizawa first sort of articulated the challenge. And the person that I have in mind here that I am going to be arguing against is Rupert's attempt to meet that challenge in his book in 2009 and then in subsequent papers. But so Rupert's proposal is to suggest that the notion of a cognitive system is actually underwritten by a more technical notion that he calls integration. So according to him, then cognitive systems are constituted by those mechanisms, capacities, abilities, external resources, etc., and we're going to call them just mechanisms for short, that differentially contribute to a specific task and that are integrated. Now, which mechanisms are integrated into a cognitive system actually depends on their conditional probability to causally contribute to a target cognitive task relative to any other causally contributed mechanism. Now, one thing that is very interesting is that there is a lot of that book, of the 2009 book, that depends on this notion of integration. Nevertheless, his definition of integration is very, very short. It's actually just a couple of paragraphs in one page, in page 42. So what I want to do first is to sort of give a more formal definition of his notion of integration to see exactly what it amounts to. So here's a little bit more formally, and then I'm going to give an example. So the formal definition is that for any given subject or agent, if you want, at any given time, let's call that Tn, there is a set of mechanisms, M1 to Mn, that causally contributes to a particular cognitive task, called the T, that is brought about by S, right? So there's a lot of mechanisms that can contribute to that cognitive task, but that doesn't mean that just for causally contributing to that task, then we thereby need to identify them as part of the cognitive system that is responsible for that task. So how do you go about determining which of those small m's, which of those individual mechanisms is actually constitutive of the cognitive system for T? Well, you need a couple of steps. First, the first step consists in listing all the mechanisms, or all the sets of mechanisms, that through time have brought about T. So now, just to give an example, suppose that through time, there's 6 different mechanisms, small m1 all the way to small m6, that have causally contributed to this task. And we list them. So the first time that the T was brought about by S, the following set of mechanisms, big M1, was causally responsible for T. This is M1, M2, M3, M4, M5. The next time that was brought about, that T was brought about by S, there were these 4 mechanisms and M2 that were engaged. Then third time, there were these 4 mechanisms. The next time, there was these 3 mechanisms, all the way to, say, the last time that T was implemented or brought about by S. All right? Now, after you have done all of this and you have listed all those, then you assign a probability based on a relative frequency for each individual mechanism in bringing about that particular task. So each probability is, of course, conditional to every other mechanisms and every other subset of mechanisms within the big set, the big M. So for instance, we might assign probabilities like this one. The probability that that M1 brought about T given M2 is 0.09. Is 0.9. The probability that M1 brought about T given M3 is 0.8. the probability that M2 brought about T, given the joint probability of M3 and M4 is 0.7, and so on. And the idea is that you looked at the contribution of each individual mechanisms relative to all other possible mechanisms, and you assigned a probability based on their frequency, and you list them from those that are more probable, namely more frequently active given any other mechanism, to those that are less frequently active and thus are less probable to have engaged T. That's the next step. And then after that, what you need to do is to identify the set of all those mechanisms which, given the frequency of co-contribution, is more likely to bring about T. That is to say, once you have ranked every probability for every individual mechanism to bring about T, give it any other mechanism and every other subset of those mechanisms, then you just have to find the set of all those mechanisms, individual mechanisms, whose combined probability is, let's say, above 0.5. Now, in the paper, I have a little footnote saying how to, the difficulties of calculating the baseline or the chance is going to be obviously dependent on the number of mechanisms that are engaged through time. But here, just for convenience, we think that chance is going to be just 0.5. So unless there is a more convenient cutoff or a much more accurate cutoff, we're just going to assume this one. So in our example, and then the idea is that those mechanisms that are more likely to co-contribute to bringing about T, those are going to constitute the integrated mechanisms and thus the cognitive system for T. So for instance, in our example, that set could be, we call it MT, or the set of mechanisms that are integrated in our cognitive system for T. And let's say that there are these three, M1, M2, M3, because let's assume the probability of T given MT is 0.78, and you calculate this by simply summing up the probabilities that we have listed in the previous slide. Every probability of each mechanism and bring it about T given any other mechanism on any other combination of all other 6 mechanisms. So that's basically all you have to do. You have to list them, figure out which ones are the ones that co-contribute and their joint probability is above 0.5 or whichever is the more accurate cutoff, and then you're done. MT, according to this view, forms an integrated set, and it is to be identified with the cognitive system for T, for that particular task, as opposed to, let's say, mere resources used in the process of bringing about T. All right, so this is a relatively formal kind of mathematical, I guess, strategy to identify which mechanisms are supposed to be integrated and form the cognitive system for T. Now, what is the purpose of doing this? Well, the idea is that we can employ Rupert's criterion of integration to solve the concerns of the demarcation challenge that have been posed for the extended cognition hypothesis. So, for instance, here is an example that I hope everyone knows about Otto, the individual with memory deficits in the paper from Clark and Chalmers. So Otto is supposed to have difficulties with memory, and nevertheless, he has this little pad where he has, the addresses and a whole bunch of information. And then at some point, he needs to go to the MoMA, I think, so he doesn't remember where the MoMA is, but he opens his pad, and then he has the address right there, and then, in a sense, he's retrieving that information from storage, and the suggestion that by functional parity, then the pad is supposed to be part of the cognitive system for remembering information. Now, the problem is that if we now apply the criterion of integration that Rupert has told us, is that the patterns of not being really part of the cognitive system that is responsible for Otto bringing about his memory, because despite the fact that he now is using it to find the right address, In reality, the history of co-contribution of that set, namely PAD plus whatever other brain mechanisms, doesn't really meet the cutoff. He has just recently started using the PAD, and as a result, if you look at the probability of co-contribution of PAD plus other parts of the brain mechanism that are responsible for remembering, you will see that the PAD is just really not meeting the cutoff. And as a result, you will have to say that the PAD is mainly used as a resource, and it is not part of the integrated system of memory. I apologize for the cutoff of the words there. This is all good, but my concern is I'm not really interested in trying to argue for the demarcation challenge or whether the extended cognition people can, sort of meet the concerns that Rupert brings about. My interest, though, is for us to focus on the fact that Rupert's definition of system or cognitive system is highly dependent on frequencies. And what I want to suggest is that if we link probability of contribution and thus frequencies to be a criteria for belonging to a cognitive system, we are going to face a difficulty. And the difficulty, just to give you kind of like a taste of it, is that we cannot accommodate what I will call diachronic dynamicity. And to make that point, let me just start off with a very philosophical thought experiment. I call it Maude and the dripping faucet. All right, so Maude is a little girl that loves mathematics. She loves especially arithmetic, and in particular, she really loves multiplication. So she, all the time that does multiplication, she spends all this time multiplying numbers by numbers. She's kind of like obsessed with multiplication. And we want to find out, which of the mechanisms that causally contribute to the cognitive processing required for basic arithmetical operations of multiplication are integrated so as to constitute the cognitive systems that are responsible for said cognitive task. Now, here's a fun fact. Every time she multiplies digits, she taps her index finger, right? Like, this is something that ever since the first time she multiplied a number, she used this fingertip and this tapping. She does it all the time. Now, what we do is that we do some of Rupert's math, and it turns out that Maude's index finger ends up being part of an integrated set of mechanisms that brings about T. Obviously, she has done it all the time. There has never been an instance of T being brought about by Maude in which the index finger wasn't tapping. So you might think, well, then Maude's index finger, let's call it M1, is part of the cognitive system MT that causes T, and T is, of course, multiplication. So this is Maude's T. This is Maude, and this is T, which is multiplication, and then there is some bunch of stuff that happens in her brain, but some of them are actually integrated. Among them is the finger. These three things, the three components, those three mechanisms, will be part of the cognitive system by Rupert's standard that help Maude bring about T. Now, calamity strikes. Poor Maude has an accident. She breaks her hand, and as a result, she can no longer move her finger. And this is a thought experiment. It is an absolutely horrible accident. For some reason, Maude has to spend an enormous amount of time in the hospital. She is in despair because she really, really, really likes math, and she can no longer do T. She can no longer multiply, despite the fact that she has all these mechanisms, but of course, she is missing the one mechanism, the one critical part that allows her to do math. But here is what is amazing. Oh, that mechanism. Turns out that in the hospital, there was a dripping faucet that made exactly the same tapping noise that her finger would do. And then she realized that she could use this dripping faucet the way in which she was using her finger to bring about T. Now, the question is the faucet part of Maude's MT? So suppose, just to make things, back to the example, so suppose to make things more interesting, she spent more time in the hospital doing math with the dripping faucet than she spent outside of the hospital prior to the accident doing math without the dripping faucet and only with her finger. So if you were to do the math now, it turns out that the dripping faucet will have a history of co-frequency of activation much higher than her finger. And then by Rupert's numbers, it looks like the dripping faucet ought to be included in the cognitive system that is responsible for Maude's bringing about T. So the question that we want to ask now is the faucet part of Maude's cognitive system for bringing about T? Well, one answer is to say, yes, it is part of the cognitive system for bringing about T. Well, if that is the answer, then I think that we will face at least one counterintuitive prediction, because once she gets better and she leaves the hospital, then she would be missing a critical component of her ability to do math, namely the dripping faucet is no longer with her. But one would imagine that she will still be able to multiply nevertheless. Why? Because she has her finger. So her finger stopped being part of the cognitive system that was responsible for bringing about T, and then, but nonetheless, it looks as though once she leaves the hospital, she will still be able to multiply because she has her cognitive, she has her finger. Now, another possibility is to say, no, of course it is not part of the cognitive system, but what would be the reason? Well, if the reason is something like, well, it is not part of her body or something like that, then it looks as though Rupert's criterion alone is not going to be able to tell us that we should exclude the dripping faucet as part of the cognitive system for bringing about T. So maybe the answer is, well, this is a false dichotomy. It's neither yes nor no, because in reality, the finger was never part of MT, right? But instead, what we find as part of a cognitive system for T is something that both the finger tapping and the dripping faucet share. So you start looking into things like, you start looking into things like the cochlea or, wave sounds or something in between. Yeah, that is all good, but then it is not going to help Rupert in his attempt to show that you could bring about or that you can define a cognitive system independently of whether or not it is inside the head, because now we're trying to move away from an example of extended cognition and sort of sneak in our assumptions that cognitive systems are somehow not extended. So it would be in detriment of Rupert's view to say that neither the finger nor the dripping faucet were actually part of the cognitive system, and rather is more like our attempt to say that there is an implicit definition of agent that is within the skull that seems to be motivating this move. So someone might say also, well, this is a very fanciful thought experiment. Nothing like that would ever happen in real life. This is just completely absurd, and we shouldn't be focused on this kind of fanciful metaphysical thought experiment. Well, what I want to say at this point is this is actually probably closer to what happens in real life with our brains, because our brains are very, very dynamic and they change over time. So let me just give you a few examples of the ways in which brains change over time. So things that we know very well is that there are very robust volumetric reductions in a number of areas. Some of them are more and less noticeable. So the caudate reduces in size as well, the cerebellum, and there is a notorious, very noticeable reduction in the cortical mantle. So if one very easy way of seeing the amount of reduction in the cortical mantle is to look at the ventricles of individuals in their 80s versus the ventricles of individuals in their 20s. You see ventricles being incredibly big in the older adults, where they're much smaller in younger adults. One way of thinking about it is that the ventricle has increased in size, but I think that the best way of thinking about it is that the cortical mantle actually has reduced in size. Another thing that we know is that the white matter integrity is reduced. We can measure this by measuring an increase in what is called white matter hyperintensities. You can do this with DTI. We know that hyperintensities are highly dependent on myelin and just the structure of the fibers in white matter. So we know that there is loss of robustness and integrity in the tracts in the white matter, and this is kind of increasing very rapidly over time as you age. There are also very important changes in dopaminergic circuits, among many others. Now, oftentimes, these changes are correlated with behavioral measures, right? And then you find paper after paper saying, there is memory retrieval is correlated with volumetric reductions in the hippocampus, for instance, or cognitive control tasks, reduction in cognitive control tasks as a result of aging are also correlated with reductions in prefrontal cortex in the cortical mantle. And you can find, paper after paper finding this correlation. But there is another thing that is very interesting. With the advent of neuroimaging and non-invasive imaging techniques in general, you can see when you use, for instance, bolt-dependent or bolt oxygenation bolt signal, or when you see, for instance, with PET scans or what have you, you can have as dependent variables metabolic or oxygen-based level differences in activity in the brain without necessarily finding behavioral differences, because now you're not using behavior as your DV, but you're actually using some sort of measure within the brain as your DV. And we have actually found that as we age, even in the absence of correlated behavioral differences, the brain seems to recruit different regions in order to perform the exact same task at the exact same performance level. And I want to discuss two sort of critical findings that point toward this claim. The first one is what my colleague here, Roberto Cabeza, calls the Harold model, which is supposed to be is an acronym for hemispheric asymmetry reduction in the old. So in one of the sort of very first observations conducted by Roberto's group in 2002, but they showed that when you have young versus old adults conducting a particular kind of task, whereas young adults tend to recruit only lateralized regions of the brain to conduct a certain task and reach a certain level of performance, older adults, when reaching the same level of performance, tend to recruit bilaterally that region, right? So you can see on the screen, young adults recruiting mainly here's right regions. Assuming I forgot if that's a CAT scan or not. I think it's not a radiological view. I think that's the right hemisphere. You see the right hemisphere being recruited in prefrontal cortex. And in older adults in exactly the same task for the exact same level of performance, you see this reduction in the hemispheric asymmetry and a much more symmetric bilateral activation. Now, interestingly, this Harold model that they suggested in 2002 has been replicated in many, many different kinds of tasks. It has been replicated in episodic retrieval, in episodic encoding, in working memory, in perception, in tasks including inhibitory control, and so on and so forth. So it looks as though a robust result in the aging literature is that as we age, we tend to recruit regions bilaterally more so than asymmetrically toward one hemisphere alone. In addition to a Harold model, there has been another very interesting model, also by the work of Roberto Cabeza, but more recently taken over by my other colleague here, Simon Davis. What Simon has shown is that as we age, there is also a change not only from the red from hemisphere to hemisphere, but also more anterior to posterior activity, and they call this the PASA model. So it's the posterior and anterior shift in aging. And the suggestion is that younger adults tend to recruit more posterior regions of the brain and less so more anterior regions for a certain task. But as we age, that pattern seems to shift. So again, the performance is the same. The tasks are kept constant, and nonetheless, we see changes in the parts of the brain that seem to get recruited for performing those particular tasks over time. So I'm going to give you kind of like a simplified model of what I think that these kinds of discoveries suggests about our notion of cognitive system. So suppose that we have a participant. Suppose that I got a bunch of money to do a study, a longitudinal study on one subject, and I call this subject Harold. And the only reason I call it Harold is because the girl in the thought experiment is Maude, and I like Harold and Maude, the movie. So anyway, so you suppose that I have this money to conduct a longitudinal study with Harold. So I put Harold in the scanner when he is in his 20s, and I ask him to do a particular task, and he does, let's say, this task, many times in order for me to get enough trials so that I can have a very robust regression and discover that M1, M2, M3, M4 here in the left side of your screen in the phase 1 were highly coactive, and by Rupert's standards, these 4 components seem to constitute the cognitive system for Harold's bringing about T. Now, time passes, and now when Harold is in his 60s, he comes back to my lab, and I do exactly the same task in exactly the same conditions as he was when he was in his early 20s. And now we see that both the Harold effect and the PASA effect occur in his brain. And then this is the right side of the screen. We see that there is a reduction from the more posterior, from the most anterior to most posterior region. So we lost them too there. And then there was this change from the reduced asymmetry to a more symmetric view, and then we gain here M5. So the question is now, what is going to be the cognitive system, Harold's cognitive system, that is responsible for T? So before we answer that question, let me just sort of go over 3 possible objections to this Harold thought experiment. So the question is, again, is it an MT or MT star? Which one is the cognitive system for T? So here are the possible objections. So the first possible objection is to say, look, the actual cognitive system that is responsible for T in Harold is neither MT nor MT star, but something like the intersection between MT and MT star. Now, the problem is that this is exactly what was going on with Maude, as you might remember. This is the last objection of Maude's thought experiment. There seems to be no principal reason to exclude one versus the other than the fact that we seem to face this contradiction. Why would you exclude one versus the other? In principle, I mean, of course, it might be possible that, and I am interpreting here fMRI as giving us something like necessary and sufficient conditions for a certain region to be engaged in a particular task. And we can discuss that. So this is an assumption here. But suppose that fMRI or PET scan really does give us something like that. then we would have the exact same problem that Maude had at the end of the thought experiment, which is to say, like, why would we exclude one of the components in MT and one of the components in MT star, other than the fact that there seems to be in contradiction? In principle, Harold at 20 wouldn't be able to do T if he didn't have, what was it? If he didn't have M2, and in principle, he wouldn't be able to do T if he didn't have M5 in phase 2. So, so this is similar to the finger tapping and the dripping faucet, in that once Maude leaves the hospital, then she doesn't have the dripping faucet, and in principle, she shouldn't be able to do the operation, but apparently she can. All right, so another possible objection is, well, this is very simple, right? Harold used M2 way more often than he used M5, because he used M2, you know, from the time he was born, say, until he was 60. And then after he was 60, he started using M5 instead of using M2. So by sheer frequency, M2 is going to be more probable to be involved in bringing about T than M5 is. Well, the problem with that is that we're just leaving the definition of what constitutes a cognitive system sort of dependent on our longevity. What if Harold was to live until he was 130, say? In that case, just by sheer, and suppose that M5 gets used since he's 60 until he's 130. So just by sheer frequency, he's going to have been used M5 more so than M2, and then it looks as though we're shifting what is the cognitive system for MT. And another concern with this second objection is changes. The brain changes not only with aging, but also during development. So, so it might be possible that there is significant change just by co-contribution from the time that Harold was 10 to when he was 20, and also it might be possible that there is another MT star from when he was 20 to 30, and another possible set from when he was, you know, 20 to 40, and so on and so forth. So, so it might be possible that we actually end up, depending on when we're doing the cutoff, with different kinds of subsystems. So, so that's not a good objection either. And finally, there is another possible objection that is a little bit more frequent, which is to say, well, but this person, Harold, was doing a different task when he was 20 relative to the task that he was doing at 60. This one is tricky because we were in the experiment, we actually kept the task fixed. But in the aging literature, it is often used as an argument in which people say, when they find particularly these differences in brain activation in absence of behavioral differences, they suggest that older adults use a different strategy or a different cognitive strategy. I have never really liked that answer because often you find these brain differences without behavioral differences, and you ask older adults if they have been doing a different strategy, and they report no. I mean, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So they will be using a different strategy without the awareness of their being using a different strategy, which is kind of weird. And then the second thing is you also can find them, these differences, in tasks that is unclear whether it is possible to have more than one strategy to complete. So Stroop effects, for instance, you can find differences in activation in Stroop effects. So Stroop effect will be exactly the same effect for older and younger adults. Their brains behave differently. But is there another way to do the Stroop effect? Is there another way of calculating very quickly math? Is there another way? Is there two strategies for pop-up attentional tasks? So oftentimes it's not even clear what two different cognitive strategies for doing these very quick and automatic tasks could be. And nonetheless, you still see these differences in old versus young. So the suggestion is that as we age, neural mechanisms exhibit this diachronic dynamicity and the change that they can change through time, and nonetheless have no changes in task performance. And I want to call that functional stability. So my suggestion is that that Rupert's definition, as it stands now, by being so completely dependent on frequencies, cannot accommodate both diachronic dynamicity and functional stability. And I think that when if we want to sort of have a good definition of what a cognitive system is, both diachronic dynamicity and functional stability should be taken into account. So how are we going to go about doing this? So in the paper, I suggest a very general strategy to how to go about doing this. And spoiler alert, there is going to be a second part of this paper that I will be presenting at the Philosophy of Science Association in Seattle in November, where I developed what I'm going to tell you a little bit here, but I develop it much more carefully in this paper, and I'm still something that I'm working on. So I will definitely welcome suggestions about it. But in general, the approach that I've been taking is sort of extracted from a little bit of some of the work that we have been doing here in the lab and that others have been doing in their labs using network analysis. So a way of sort of capturing what I'm trying to do is the following. We can think about brains as hierarchical networks of nodes and edges. Edges are the connections between nodes. And in network or in topological analysis of brain activity, people employ a number of different measures, things like clustering coefficients and local efficiency. Many of these things you probably all are familiar with. One concern that I think that a lot of people have expressed is that most of the data that we have on neural networks is based on resting state data. Nevertheless, there is a kind of like a relatively novel trend to try to understand how networks are organized in the brain when participants are doing specific tasks. But most of the data are, about how networks are organized when participants are doing certain tasks. Most of the data is compiled over very short temporal windows. That is to say, they're doing a task that lasts like 4 seconds or something like that. And then you can see, how different brain regions get coactive and how do they form, certain kinds of networks with certain characteristics. But they are always sort of confined to the time window of the particular task that they are doing. And there is very little research on how these networks change through time. Thankfully, in the last few years, there's been some new algorithms that are actually trying to see how networks and network configurations change through time. So one of the earlier ones is based on this notion of scale inclusivity and notion of modularity. Notion of modularity are the idea of modularity are basically nodes and edges that tend to form groups that are particularly stable through a number of different changes. One of those changes is time. So this is work that my student Matt Stanley conducted a few years ago before actually starting working in our lab. And what he was looking at was measures of modularity during different working memory tasks. And the hot colors here show increases sort of robustness of the module, which is measured by this measure called scale inclusivity. So we see there's certain regions in the default network, for instance, that are more robustly integrated with themselves when you have one particular kind of task, like the 1 minus back task, but become less integrated when the task changes. So you can see actually these modules varying as a function of task. And more recently, we have seen this beautiful work by Danny Bassett and colleagues showing how brain networks actually change as a function of learning. So the way in which he conducted this sort of study is by looking at modular organization during learning. And as you might imagine, when you learn a task and where you learn to do a particular skill or something, your brain must change. Learning somehow must be reflected and changes in the brain. But what kind of changes specifically? So one way of looking at this is by looking at what is the, what's the structure of the brain network of a person who is naive, as they call it, or who has never actually done a particular task. And then you have a topological map of how the network looks like that. And then you select those. So if you see here in the axis, in the diagonal on the matrix, you see this sort of red blocks. So these red blocks are actually modules of modules, if you want. It's like a higher order matrix that contains covariations across highly covariant nodes, namely modules. So this is like a module of a module. And then you can see exactly how these modules are changing as a function of learning. So another way of seeing in this more specifically is you take one particular module. So for instance, this module is highly, this is sort of confined to the motor areas. And then the second module, I think, is confined to the visual areas. And then you see very clear, how highly coactive are these modules through the stages of being naive, early, or, sort of skilled until you end up being very skilled. This is another way of seeing it that I put below. You have the naive person, then early learning, middle learning, and late learning. And then you see how these modules that are highly correlated, not only at a particular time, namely the naive time, but also highly correlated with themselves through different times. How do they behave through the learning process? So of course, in this particular model that they use, time gets parameterized, but not in a continuous fashion, because you have 4 different discrete times. You have naive, early, middle, and late. But my suggestion, and what I am hoping to do now, is to sort of leverage the infrastructure that Danny and others have proposed, and generate a way of parameterizing time that doesn't make it discrete, but rather makes it continuous. And my thought is that something like this might actually help us to understand how specific brain regions contribute to a particular task, and how do they change and fluctuate through time. So with this, I will like to then to conclude. So how does this relate to the issue of cognitive ontologies? So I started off this paper or talk, I guess, suggesting that when we talk about cognitive systems, we typically employ something like a bottom, this is supposed to be top-down, a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. And the suggestion is that neither of them is going to be really sufficient. It is true that we don't really know what an agent is, and maybe we shouldn't give it for granted, but it is also true that just going from the bottom up might not be sufficient. So the mapping of mind to brain, this is something that I have insisted a few times in other places, is something that we probably are going to have to resolve somewhere in the middle. Now, but I also want to suggest that no mapping of the mind and brain, no cognitive ontology is going to be complete without taking into account the fact that brains change over time. And my word is that that nowadays people that work in cognitive ontologies, they only look at static neural data. And what I hope that I can convey with this talk is that the mechanisms that support our cognitive operations are dynamic. They're dynamic probably at very different temporal stages. And I think that this fact might not easily be captured by cognitive ontologies that only look at static neural data. And with that, I end. Thank you.